Okay, so we're picking back up with federalism and interpretation. We're looking at U.S. v. Lopez, a more recent federalism case. So this is significant because there is a shift in the court's interpretation of federalism in the 1980s, and the court's position on federal government power changed. Ronald Reagan, who was president during the 1980s, had the opportunity to appoint new justices to the court, and those that he chose are essentially or were committed to the idea of states' rights. One of the things that they did, led by Chief Justice William Rehnquist, was sort of roll back federal intervention. This is called the devolution, D-E-V-O-L-U-T-I-O-N, devolution, revolution. And so what it means is that they sort of took some of the authority that had been given to the national government through interpretation changes over time, and they gave it back to the states. So, for example, in the case of U.S. v. Lopez, the court ruled that Congress could not use the interstate commerce law to ban handguns within 1,000 feet of schools. And the court says essentially that gun control laws were a state, not a federal issue. And so this is one of these federalism cases that limits the authority of the national government. Okay, so dual federalism features separate but equally powerful state and national governments. And one of the issues of dual federalism was the idea of nullification, right? This is gives states the authority to declare national laws invalid. There was the nullification crisis in the 19th century with Andrew Jackson and his vice president. Nullification was a way that states believed they could retain their own supreme level of power within their own spheres or within their own constitutionally given authority. Dual federalism is looked at like it's a layer cake where there's very separate and distinct layers and they do not intermix. It's a very narrow interpretation of the powers of the federal government, and it ends in the 1930s when we move to cooperative federalism. Dual federalism ends with the Great Depression, and as FDR is elected in 1932 to the presidency, one of his big campaign promises was that he would give a new deal for the American people. And this required the powers of the national, state, and local governments to become much more integrated, and required that they work together to provide a lot of these New Deal programs. So before the 1930s, the federal system at each level or layer of government, national, state, or local, had very clearly defined powers and responsibilities. Cooperative federalism is given the analogy, though, of a marble cake instead of a layer cake. And with marble cakes, you see that if there are two flavors like chocolate and vanilla, they're all swirled and mixed together, and you can't break apart a piece and say this is for sure just chocolate or this is for sure just vanilla. The responsibilities are very much integrated and very overlapping. It becomes so intertwined that it's very hard to tell where each one began and ended. Cooperative federalism is a result basically of the New Deal programs and the New Deal was to find solutions to the Depression, which was affecting people across the United States, and for the first time in American history, the national government exercises unprecedented authority. New Deal programs forced all levels of government to work cooperatively with one another. Congress wanted to bypass state legislatures, which often did not represent urban interests, and so a lot of local governments became more important players in national politics. There are politicians that challenge the constitutionality of the New Deal programs, and at first the Supreme Court sides with them, but that's where we have FDR's court packing program. Another way that the national government shares power and responsibility is through fiscal federalism, and fiscal means money, so it's the way that the cost of administering the government through taxing, spending, and providing grants are shared between the state and the national governments. The local governments get money dispersed to them through the states. Okay, So when the federal government creates programs, they don't always provide enough money to the states to implement them. The states generally don't tend to like that. And so these policies are often referred to as unfunded mandates. And there are also categorical grants, block grants, and programmatic request. This is the way that the national government, these are three ways the national government provides. Okay, in the grant system, it's divided up into categorical grants and block grants. So the first is categorical grants, and these grants are important because they provide state and local government with additional money for projects. They set sort of national standards for policy priorities, such as the national highway system. It's also the reason why we have because of grants, we have a consistent legal drinking age in the United States. And the national government's grant system attempts to equally or financially equalize rich and poor states and local cities as well. So categorical grants are important. They have to be used for a specific purpose, and the funding provided to state and local governments is a way of persuading those governments to adopt the policies or the objectives of the national government. So project grants are based on merit, and then you can also have a categorical grant that's a formula grant, which is literally a mathematical equation that's written, and the different criteria or components those numbers are plugged into the formula, and that's how states or local government are given monies based on the formula. Block grants sort of emerged in the 1980s. President Ronald Reagan advanced what he referred to as new federalism, which is, again, a return of power to the states. And this, as I mentioned earlier, became known as the devolution revolution. So instead of categorical grants, Reagan favored block grants, which are much less restrictive in how the money can be spent. So it gives the states or the local governments that are receiving the block grants a lot more authority in how they choose to spend the money. So block grants are usually allocated for general policy areas such as education and healthcare rather than specific programs, and it gives states a lot more discretion. So a big concern with fiscal federalism are mandates. Mandates are orders or policy decisions from the national government which require states or local governments to comply with federal rules or follow instructions from the national government, basically under threat of penalties or fines, or as a means to actually receive one of those categorical or block grants that we talked about. And mandates are fine. A mandate is the way in which we have a consistent legal drinking age of 21. It was a federal mandate that all states raise their drinking age to 21 before they would get funding for maintenance of federal highways in their states. Which is fine, but unfunded mandates are generally not very popular. Unfunded mandates is when the national government passes laws or gives directions to the states to implement policy without additional federal funding. So they tell them, you have to do this, but you have to figure out how to pay for it on your own. And that tends to be very irritating to the state. Programmatic requests are federal funds that are given for special projects within a state or congressional district. They're informally known as earmarks. Sometimes they're referred to as pork barrel legislation. Earmarks are not competitively awarded, and so there are some ethical concerns about earmarks because a lot of organizations or state and local representatives, not the elected representatives, but citizens within the state and local areas in which are applying for these programmatic requests or earmarks, use paid political lobbyists who try to get federal funds for their clients, which could be states, cities, universities, nonprofit groups, interest groups. We'll talk about those. Members of Congress also attempt to get these funds so they can, in reference to the pork barrel legislation, so they can bring home the bacon. And so one of the states which has in the past had the most amount of pork barrel legislation was West Virginia. Robert Byrd was a very long-time senator from West Virginia. He actually passed away while in office. And West Virginia does not have a particularly strong economy. There's a lot of coal mining in West Virginia. There's not a great deal of economic growth, but West Virginia, while Robert Byrd was the senator, had more bridges, more parks, more statues named after Robert Byrd, because it was a way that he could, when he was campaigning for re-election, say, look at the jobs I brought to West Virginia, because somebody had to be paid to build that statue or build that park or build that bridge. And so it helped a very sluggish economy sort of grow, but the problem with earmarks is that everybody puts in, all of the states provide tax dollars or tax revenue, and then because earmarks are used with federal money, or paid for with federal money, then, there could be money from Texas going to build a bridge in West Virginia. Is that fair or equitable? That's where the ethical concerns arise. Okay, so to conclude, understanding federalism, there are some important advantages for democracy of a federal government structure. It allows people to have increased access to government. It gives people the opportunity to solve problems locally, and those local solutions can then be implemented nationally. It's very hard for political parties or interest groups to dominate all politics because there are so many points of access to elected officials. But there are some disadvantages as well. States have very different levels of service. So Texas is one of the states that was reported in the last 2 years to be a great recipient of federal money. And so the level of service is different in Texas than, say, perhaps New Mexico. Local interest can sometimes counteract national interest. For example, having all of the money earmarked to West Virginia to build roads and bridges in Senator Byrd's honor maybe wasn't in the best interest of the nation. And then there's also the concern that there are too many levels of government and too much money is unaccounted for or spent poorly.